Well, four of Canada's largest police associations are calling for change after 5 officers were killed in line of duty in 2022.
We are saying what most Canadians are saying, and enough is enough. We can't allow the death of these officers and the violence in our communities to go unchallenged. So we are going to get together and we are going to take a look at and we're going to examine the issues that have led to the deaths of these 5 police officers. And we're going to analyze the research, and then we're going to come up with some recommendations and call for some meaningful change.
When it comes to that study, they say everything is on the table. To talk about this, it's time for the Power Panel. Emily Nicola is a columnist with Le Devoir. Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press and a professor of Native Studies at the University of Manitoba. Paul Wells is a journalist and author, and Marie Vestel is with Le Devoir. Hi. So, Paul, I want to start with you. The police associations say that they plan to review and do research on what is and is not working within the current system, and they said that everything is going to be on the table. Is this a good move on their part, do you think?
I mean, sure it is, and you can see why they're so highly motivated to act and to speak out. There's been a really tragic chain of deaths of officers on duty. It's less clear to me what the federal government is going to do, especially so long as the federal government is run by the Liberal Party, because relaxing bail conditions has been the general direction of Liberal policy since they came to office, and there are reasons for that. When bail was harder to get, it was always disproportionately harder to get for Indigenous and minority suspects. And while bail is hard to get, while suspects are rotting on remand in detention, they are cut off from their supports, having a hard time finding the stability that allows you to avoid a life of crime, and they're surrounded by bad examples. So that's why the Liberals have been moving the direction they've been at. And that's why this issue is attractive to the opposition, because the Liberals are unlikely to reverse that direction anytime soon, despite the recent events.
Do you think, Marie, that this will put pressure on all 3 levels of government to do something, particularly, as Paul notes, the federal government, that now they've come out with this statement and they're all in unison saying something needs to change here?
I think it might, and I agree with Paul that it's a good opportunity for the opposition. It's not coincidence that Pierre Poilievre gave his 2nd press conference, I think, since he's been leader, about this topic during the holidays. But I also agree, I'm not sure the Liberals will do something, and I'm not sure that the issue is necessarily the bail system at large. 4 of the police officers that were killed since last September were killed by guns. Mm-hmm. I think that is a growing issue, one that the government says it's addressing. Perhaps there could be criticism on that, but I think that's part of what's going on. And if you look at the bail system, all the reasons Paul enumerated are correct. I also looked at violent reoffending numbers. There's no numbers on people on bail, but if you look at parole, 0.5% of people on parole will reoffend with a violent crime. It's a very, very low rate. And so these cases are not common. They're tragic, but they're not that common. And if you look at this particular person, this particular suspect, he had a lengthy criminal past. He was accused of robbery, went to prison, stabbed someone while he was in prison, was a reinsertion. There were concerns about his reinsertion. Then he committed another crime, assaulted a police officer, and firearms-related offenses. He was denied bail, granted bail, then disappeared. Perhaps the problem with the bail system could be the administration of it, and looking at particular cases with more judgment when there are situations like this one. I'm not sure throwing the whole system out the window or putting it all into question is necessarily the best way to look at what's going on.
Okay, Niigaan, Emily, let me bring you into this, and we'll start with Niigaan. How do you balance this call from police associations, which say, more resources are needed around this movement? And I talked to Mark Baxter, one of the heads of the associations, about this, with this move to defund the police and address police violence.
There's a common fallacy out there that, there's empirical evidence, particularly here on the prairies, that the solution for violence against the police is more police. The fact is that when these police are in these situations, almost always, as Paul pointed out, they involve resources and support of those offenders who have often led lives that are often very traumatic in poverty and so on. And so the issue is more mental health. Now, in 2018, Doug Ford came in promising almost $2 billion in supports for mental health, and then almost quickly, after a crisis involving violence against police, turned over half of that money towards building more police, putting more money into police. And here we are 5 years later, looking almost at the exact scenario, seeing people who are taking violence against police, and absolutely we should be using this as a tragedy, studying the issue, studying where it came from, looking at issues like bail. But the solution is not found in more police. It is in finding areas that support the police in their work. There is everything from safe consumption sites to situations around poverty organizations. Right here in downtown Winnipeg, we're seeing the most amount of homicides in Winnipeg history this past year. And the answer is not more police. The answer is supporting people on the streets who are perpetrating these harms against the police, so that the police who are frankly unequipped to be able to deal with the issues of poverty and mental health, to be able to do their jobs more efficiently. You save money that way.
Emily, is it more training support for police as well? If the solution isn't, and I put this to Mark Baxter as well, if the solution is not simply more boots on the ground, does it involve, as Nigan says, mental health supports and also training as well?
Well, it's really not surprising that you're seeing just violence in general in Canada rise in the last 2 years, given the impact of the pandemic and the impact it has had on people's mental health and people's economic situation. So you're going to have an increase of risk for police doing their job, but if people are in crisis, it's mostly a risk for themselves and for people around us for whom it's not their job. And I think that's what's been increasing in Canada. That being said, to your question, I very much think that when you have a state when a person is using gun in a way that's very dangerous, or a person that is in a mental health crisis so high that they're now being a danger to themselves or other, there's been a lot of systemic fails behind that state of crisis that have nothing to do with police. Police is stuck intervening there, but I agree with Nigan, that's not where the optimal solution is to that. And I just want to add that it's true that there's been a lot of police officers dying in the last years, and it's a tragedy as well. But we need to be careful not to have solutions that are actually going to increase the level of risks for everyday citizens who are in contact with the police, because unfortunately that's oftentimes the solutions that are put forward by police association, is that the safety of one body of people is reached at the expense of the safety of the general population that is most in contact with police. And because you have essentially those competing rights to safety, you have a very, very tricky situation politically to look at when you look at actual solutions. And just looking at, yes, we need to have more safety for officers without looking at the exact solutions that they're proposing and how that might actually endanger the citizens that they work with, I think it would be also very dangerous as well.
Yeah, well, solutions are desperately needed, and you're right, it absolutely is a complex issue. Guys, we blew through that segment, so only time for one round there, but stay with us.
So how does the federal government respond to this growing pressure? Time to bring in our Sunday Scrum. With us this week, Rob Rousseau, former CBC Parliamentary Bureau Chief here in Ottawa. Sherelle Evelyn is the Managing Editor of The Hill Times, also here with me in Ottawa. And Jason Markusoff is with CBC News in Calgary. Good to see everybody. I'm going to start with you, Jason, if I can. This originated from the desk of Doug Ford, but it seems to be a growing kind of call from police associations, the premiers, Pierre Poilievre, that something has to happen here, that bail should be made harder for those accused of serious crimes, particularly crimes related to firearms. Is there something to this, do you think, or is this more likely a political move, or is it both?
I mean, I think there are a lot of people out there in Canada, all over the country, when they heard that the individual charged with one of the individuals charged with killing the OPP officer wasn't on bail for a firearms-related offense, and involving assaulting a police officer as well. back in December 21, people were stunned and would want action. I think that when something is so shocking to the senses occurs, like a murder of a young police officer, people want action. It's reasonable to want something to be done to prevent this, especially if it seemed like there was this discussion about having this guy could have been behind bars. When you strip the nuance, you strip away the nuance like that, it seems, the idea that from the premiers that you want immediate action, sounds like that's a political thing. You want to, stop the thing that allowed this to happen, perhaps. But the justice system doesn't work that way. Not many governments, and reasonably so, take immediate action to reform the entire justice system and its various rules and moving parts based on one or two incidences. So I wouldn't expect immediate action from most governments, certainly not this Liberal government, especially in wake of several Supreme Court rulings that have discussed the idea that there is, this obligation to give people a chance to, the innocence before guilty, before guilt principle. There are other principles at play, certainly the Gladue principles regarding in an individual's circumstances, the effects of colonialism on Indigenous people. There are many moving parts to this. I would note that the premiers are actually getting ahead of where the police associations are on this. Even the police associations who certainly don't want their, are certainly shocked by the taking their own, haven't called for this specific thing yet at this point.
Sherelle, it's my understanding that part of the government's approach here is, yes, in response to the Gladue principles, but also in response to, obviously, an overrepresentation of Indigenous peoples who are incarcerated, Black people who are incarcerated in this country. But the risk seems to be that the government is called out as being soft on crime. And I wonder how they balance that, given that the narrative, you can see the narrative sort of starting to unfold in that direction.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a narrative that the Liberal government particularly hasn't had to, push back against for quite a long time. It's a pretty common cudgel, with especially opposition Conservatives, that this government's soft on crime, and only principled Conservatives are going to be able to keep Canadians safe. It does put the government in a bit of an interesting position, because it is in the midst of trying to engage in other justice system reforms that on their face may directly contradict what is being asked for here. Things like removing mandatory minimums, letting justices and judges be more flexible, have more discretion. Things like that. So making bail harder to obtain may indeed keep, some dangerous offenders behind bars longer. But given how the criminal justice system works or doesn't work, like you said, that's going to disproportionately be consequential for, Indigenous people, for especially Black people. This isn't about keeping people who are convicted of crimes in custody. Right. It's about keeping people who are only charged or suspected of crimes. And one of the key things that the premiers are asking for in this letter is that reverse onus of basically having the accused have to prove they should be out, as opposed to the prosecution having to prove they would be in. And that, on top of an already very inequitable bail system, that puts a lot of, undue pressure on people who don't have the same advantages as people who may have the money or the privilege to, get out and, potentially keep committing these crimes. And don't forget, there is still that discretion. Public safety risk is still supposed to be assessed. So whether or not that's being done, I think, is a whole other question.
Yeah, or whether that assessment needs to be different without even changing the bail conditions, whether there's something they could do on that front preemptively. Rob?
Well, I think this discussion is somewhat analogous to the discussion you were having earlier with the Premier, in that, like healthcare, justice is a shared responsibility in Canada. The federal government is supposed to come up with and change the criminal code, and in this case, it's being done. It's being urged to change the criminal code or make the changes that it made by the Supreme Court of Canada, that said too often those who are presumed innocent stay in jail for too long, and often the charges are withdrawn. That's the pressure on. That's the pressure from the courts. The other shared responsibility for the administration of justice in Canada is at the provincial level, where the provinces are supposed to administer the courts and look after policing And that includes when people do breach bail conditions, that the police are supposed to go after them and say, yay, you jumped bail or you breached your bail condition, you're going back in prison. And that didn't happen. It didn't happen in the case of the person who's accused of killing Constable Persichala. And so, look, everybody looks for simple answers to complex questions. Is this a political issue? I don't think it is. Not when you get the NDP Attorney General in British Columbia saying that this has had unintended consequences. People who are out on the streets who shouldn't be there. And when you have the new Premier, David Eby, saying, we've got to change this. But at the same time, the government has a fundamental responsibility to guarantee certain rights in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. That includes the presumption of innocence, and a speedy trial as well is a right. So it's not an easy issue.
No, and Jason, I should say to Rob's point, when Justice Lametti was talking about Bill C-75 earlier this month, that piece of legislation making its way through, said it was developed with the provinces and is still being implemented. So Rob's right. Some of this is about how provinces are implementing laws and following up on them with policing and what have you.
And here's one of the realities that, contrary to the idea that there's catch and release system, over the time that the Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been in power, the proportion of people in provincial custody or in provincial prisons who are in remand or just awaiting trial, not been convicted yet, has increased. It's now 2/3 in Ontario, Doug Fort's province. It's more than 3/4. So the provinces actually have in a lot of justice has been more reluctant to shift towards more of a innocent until proven guilty, more progressive bail system than some would allege.
Okay, I'm out of time here. I'm sorry. We should have had more time, but you all had lots to say. Thank you. Sherelle, you can start us off on the next round when we talk about healthcare. Rob, Sherelle, Jason, thank you guys. Appreciate it.